one more note, I guess. Yes, thank you. So we'll start with our first short talk, which is from competition to collaboration, fostering a culture of data sharing in the NIH HEAL data ecosystem. And I'll let each of the presenters introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Heather Barnes, and I am with RTI International. I'll let my colleague Barndy introduce herself.
I am Brandy Farlow. I'm with the Renaissance Computing Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
So we are here today serving as data stewards with the NIH HEAL Initiative's HEAL data ecosystem. We're presenting recent work done by the HEAL data stewards to learn more about some common barriers to researchers' data sharing activities and the types of programming that we've begun to implement to help foster and incentivize a culture of data sharing. So first we'll introduce the HEAL data ecosystem, including a little bit about its architecture, its primary objectives. Then we'll take a look at some of the primary inhibitors to data sharing that researchers have identified in the literature. On the other side of the coin, we'll look at literature about data sharing benefits and incentives. And then finally, we'll share some of the programs that HDE has started to develop to encourage and build a data sharing culture. So the NIH HEAL initiative is a collaborative, multi-institute effort supporting research to accelerate scientific and clinical discovery for treating pain and opioid use disorders. The HEAL Data Ecosystem, or HDE, provides the infrastructure for the HEAL initiative's data management and sharing strategy through coordination of two primary tools and support teams. The tools include the HEAL Data Platform and HEAL Semantic Search, and the support teams include the HEAL Data Stewardship Group and the HEAL Data Platform team. So these partners work together to aid investigators in making their data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable to meet the HEAL data sharing compliance requirements. We also work to develop the HEAL data platform so that researchers can discover and use HEAL data sets. We've developed HEAL semantic search so that researchers can explore the conceptual knowledge, synonyms, and relationships that intersect with HEAL research areas. So the HEAL data platform is a search and discovery interface powered by metadata and secure cloud-based workspaces. Instead of storing the data, the platform interoperates with individual repositories in which HEAL data are deposited, providing secure access to data sets. The HEAL data stewards provide guidance for selecting repositories and submitting data sets and metadata. And one of the primary goals of the HDE is to foster a collaborative data sharing culture. HEAL researchers face many of the common barriers to data sharing. So we initiated this literature review project that we're referencing today, in part to help drive our efforts to improve researchers' capacity and willingness to share HEAL-funded data. Our initial effort was to conduct a literature review on common data sharing behaviors to find out what the research literature says about those factors that inhibit or encourage data sharing by researchers. We then developed a poster and an online resource to share with HEAL-funded investigators. We shared the poster at the annual HEAL PI meeting, and we've developed a case report for journal publication. So what does the literature have to say about common barriers to data sharing? We reviewed dozens of research articles that had findings about data sharing inhibitors and some of the factors that tended to surface most often, including a fear of being scooped, fear of scooping, a lack of funding or training, the significant costs of sharing data, concerns about sharing sensitive data, concerns about receiving appropriate credit for their work, and other publication-related barriers. Many researchers fear being scooped, which typically implies losing publication options for their findings if they openly share data before publication. We did find that this factor varied across disciplines. So some domains tend to be more collaborative in nature, whereas others focus more on individual contributions. So we realize it's important not to generalize here, but this particular fear was mentioned in quite a few articles. Second, sharing data often requires some funding, some resources, and um, clearly well-resourced research institutions are better equipped to cover those costs for their researchers or to help them navigate grant funding. Another frequently mentioned concern in the literature was sharing sensitive data sets and the need to protect participant privacy. And I would echo that we hear this concern often from HEAL-funded investigators. We have frequent conversations about which components of a study could be shared, even if sensitivity concerns prevent open sharing of the data itself. Another frequently mentioned concern in the literature is the lack of recognition across the board for dataset publication. We recognize that this issue may be shifting in some domains. However, the current literature indicates that it's been a barrier. Acknowledging dataset publication as part of tenure and renewal packages could support researchers' choice to share their data openly. And now I will switch to Barndy, and she'll talk a little bit about some of the factors we identified that support and encourage data sharing.
Thank you so much, Heather. So in the research literature, there are a number of supportive benefits to data sharing. This includes fostering an open science culture, positively impacting public health, increasing citations, providing markers to note productivity, improve reputation and lend towards career advancement, a potential for reciprocal open data access, and improve potential for new collaborations with others who are researching similar topics. Shortly put, there are numerous benefits to open data sharing for both the researcher and science as a whole. But researchers often remain hesitant to share data because they do not want to be scooped or lose control of their research. And that is certainly understandable. That said, there are a lot of things that we can do to help encourage data sharing, focusing on areas such as promoting an open research culture, providing improved and more concrete opportunities for career advancement and citation related to data sharing, and focusing on the need for research access, the benefits to scientific efficiency and potential greater impacts we can have potential greater impacts that we can have with our research by creating a culture of open data sharing may be fairly convincing for many of the current holdouts. And indeed, the literature kind of suggests that many common themes related to this topic of supporting a culture of open science and data sharing. And we'll kind of get to these in a little more depth shortly. This includes discussing the need to transform the often competitive research culture towards one that supports open science, support researcher career advancement, providing credit for researcher contributions, and optimizing publications and citation opportunities. And there is so much that we have to gain by doing this. Sharing helps move the needle towards open science practices, and these practices improve researcher access to data, publications, and other research products generated by publicly funded research. In short, it provides scientists the tools that they need to more efficiently and impactfully move science forward, and there's a lot to gain. Open data sharing can have potential impact on public health. Broad access to publicly funded research helps improve health outcomes, expanding knowledge about health problems and research-based solutions. This is actually one of the primary focuses of the HEAL initiative as we seek to end addiction and assist with the opioid crisis. But beyond that, open data sharing has definite positive impacts on citations. Currently, research indicates that making data sets available with a publication can actually boost the citation count on that paper by 25%. This has huge potential to enhance the study's impact on their field. It can also benefit productivity, reputation, and career advancement. In fact, sharing data expands opportunities for researchers to have their data reused and cited in other publications, supporting their case for promotion and increasing the impact of their research. While different fields may vary in their recognition of dataset publication, the potential for citation can be very helpful. It is not a straight idea that if you share your data, you'll get promoted, but the data exposure and the potential for others to see what a researcher has produced and place value on it, cite it, and reuse it can certainly have impacts that lead towards this. Open data sharing can also benefit the research culture and provide a researcher with additional access to other research data. A culture of data sharing supports reuse and ensures all researchers can find and use data that may be of benefit. Though, of course, this must include adequate awareness of sensitive data needs. This is particularly important in the HEAL culture and it's certainly something that we need to consider in the greater research culture as well. So as we mentioned, we work for the HEAL initiative. The HEAL stewards have several programs and resources to assist and encourage researchers in our program with data sharing concerns, and we wanted to take some time to share these today. These include several presentations and outreach initiatives, consultations, and tools and trackers that we have created to really enhance data sharing in our ecosystem. While they are HEAL focused, some of these resources, in particular the presentations and the outreach materials, may prove very interesting to audiences beyond HEAL, and you are more than welcome to check these resources out. So we did this landscape analysis we did a landscape analysis, and after that, a lot of these resources were developed, and we've been rolling them out and kind of modifying them. So this has been a whole effort trying to make these resources work. We have programs addressing sensitive data, where and how to share data, steps in the process, policy compliance issues, and a lot of open resources that are available to everyone. We did roll these out before we knew better, but from a point of information, we've been able to modify these existing programs as well. So beyond that, myself and Heather, as well as a larger group of our colleagues, wrote a paper about data sharing challenges and misconceptions and discussing how we can incorporate fair ideas into data sharing to benefit science. This paper is called From Fear to Fair, Challenging Misconceptions Around Data Sharing. It's available at the link in the presentation, but it is also in the chat, maybe. But you can also learn more about the HEAL initiative and our open data efforts from healdatafair.org. So finally, we would just like to acknowledge the NIH HEAL initiative, which provides funding for the HEAL data ecosystem. And thanks for taking time to listen to our talk today. We're certainly happy to take any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you, Brandy and Heather. We have time for questions. I'm not seeing any in the chat. Give it maybe one more minute.
Start us off. For someone new to maybe to the NIHL or to your resources, where would you recommend like a librarian start? What's the one resource you would point us to?
I would probably take a look at this sort of one-page overview that we created called From Fear to Fair, and it's in the chat. This is sort of a short summary of the data that we found, right? So if you click through, at the end of the document are the references that we refer to in the talk that specifically pertain to research data sharing behaviors. And then we summarize those in a list of blockers and a list of sort of the top 10 reasons to share data. So we created this resource to be helpful to investigators. And it's also been helpful for us in terms of kind of thinking about, framing how we're planning our programming. We definitely have put a lot of time and effort into things like the sensitive data, working with PIs to figure out, even if they can't share their sensitive data, they can potentially share their metadata. A lot of our investigators actually have sort of baseline questions about how do I prepare my data? What kind of data can I share? Why should I share my data? What type of, if I'm how does the policy affect me? How does the NIH sharing policy affect me? Those types of things. So we created this sort of one pager to help start to address some of those. Also, the HEAL HDE website, healdatafair.org, has a lot of information about things like metadata, defining terms, defining policies, and sort of setting ground level expectations for investigators.
Well, I think we can move on to our second short talk. If you do have questions for Brandy or Heather, you can still put those in the chat. And if we have time at the end of our short talk block, we can take a few more questions we're able to at the end. So our next short talk. Oh, wait, someone raised a hand. Is that to ask a question?
It was a misclick. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries.
I
All
actually
right.
did have a question. Sorry.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
A very quick one, kind of about the choice. Maybe you said it quickly and I kind of missed it. Did you focus your literature search on, I don't know, publications or titles that were relevant to the HEAL infrastructure, or did you search broadly? That's kind of what I'm curious about. What was your kind of scope?
We searched pretty broadly at first, but I think we ended up with a lot of articles that pertain to biomedical data sharing, because that's the sort of the most. And one of the things we found is that the culture of data sharing varies so widely across disciplines. It's a little bit difficult to generalize. So it's most helpful to sort of focus our findings on biomedical data sharing. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think with 1 minute ahead of schedule, we'll move to our second short talk, which is integrating clinical research data management into data collection best practices.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, hello everybody. My name is Genevieve Milliken and I am the Data Services Librarian at the NYU Health Sciences Library. And I'll actually invite my, my co-presenter, Michelle Yee, to introduce herself.
Hi, excuse me. I'm the research data and metadata, excuse me, management librarian within data services, and I'm very happy to work with Genevieve and to present on this topic today.
Yes. So this talk is about kind of a curriculum update that we did at the Health Sciences Library, and it's sort of part of the data education team, where we were sort of incorporating CRDM into our REDCap classes. And clinical research data management is really essential for ensuring that research data is accurate, complete, and adheres to regulatory standards. As the use of data collection tools such as REDCap grows in research, the importance of integrating something like CRDM into REDCap education really became apparent for us. And REDCap's versatility makes it an excellent tool for managing clinical research data management, but users must understand that specific requirements and practices unique to clinical research really need to be incorporated and known when using that tool. So this talk really does focus on blending CRDM best practices into our REDCap classes to increase things like research integrity and compliance. So just as a quick agenda, I want to talk about what is clinical research data management and specifically the difference between CRDM and RDM. So they do have a lot of overlaps, but they do have some differences that I think are worth considering. Also, just because I don't know everybody's background on the call, I definitely want to talk about how data collection in clinical settings work, and the history of REDCap education at our library. And a lot of our sort of bread and butter comes from REDCap education. It's a big part of what we do. And then also like merging this idea of theory and practice. And I think I'm so thankful for Michelle for her help on folding a lot of her knowledge, especially around metadata standards, into our education. So first things first is this idea or sort of the difference between research data management and CRDM. I won't go through every sort of text on the screen right here, but I do want to mention a few. Both clinical and sort of general research data management involve things like organizing, storing, and maintaining data. But there are some key differences, and some of them include things like our regulatory frameworks. So we are guided by strict requirements such as the IRB, FDA, HIPAA, and good clinical practices guidelines. And this is really to ensure patient safety and data integrity. where RDM does have rules and regulations, but they may not be so stringent and they may not relate to patient health information. And then also data sensitivity. So in clinical research, we're often dealing with sensitive personal health data, which requires careful attention to things like data privacy and security. And then we also have this like very large focus on compliance. So things like protocols and audits, proper documentation for clinical trials and patient interactions, where RDM may be more focused on, the FAIR principles or open data, which are, which I love and was so important to me in library school and sort of really got me interested in data librarianship. And then lastly, when we think of clinical research, there's a time sort of sensitive element to it where we are using our data to gain some knowledge that may have some impact on our patient care and clinical outcomes. And in the middle, sort of the overlaps, yes, both have data policies. If anyone working in the data sphere, we, are sort of have to adhere to some of policy, whether that's institutional or funder requirements or publisher requirements. All of this data will go through the data lifecycle. We also care about things like data quality and data standards, and very importantly, hopefully there's always some sort of library involvement in all of this work. And I should say, even with these commonalities, there are very nuanced between CRDM and RDM. So how are our patients or our patrons collecting data? So how are our clinicians and researchers at our institution doing this? Often they are using patient surveys and questionnaires. So they're going to be gathering patient-reported outcomes, health histories, system trackings, and these can be administered with REDCap. And I'll go over a little bit about REDCap is in a second if you're not familiar with that platform. We also have clinical assessments and observations, so data collected by healthcare providers during things like physical exams, clinical tests, routine checkups, and often REDCap can be used in some of these practices. And then we have our electronic health record integration. So clinical settings often use our EHR systems to track patients, and this data can actually be linked to REDCap. So here we have an integration between Epic and REDCap. And then things like library results and diagnostic tests, and so on and so forth. That said, what is REDCap? So REDCap is actually an acronym for Research Electronic Data Capture. It was built in 2003 at Vanderbilt University, specifically for data collection in clinical settings. So it does build surveys and questionnaires or data collection instruments. And if you've ever worked with something like Qualtrics or Google Forms, this has some of the same functionality, but it is HIPAA compliant and highly secure for collecting some of the data that I just mentioned. It is really customizable and flexible. It allows our users to build and manage surveys and databases without really having a strong programming background. It also allows for a lot of customizable forms and workflows to meet a diverse set of needs. So we often work with our patrons and they'll come to us for consultations where they'll have very widely different use cases for using REDCap, and we need to kind of figure out a good workflow for them. And I think REDCap does allow for some flexible accommodation for these types of projects. It also allows us to securely manage our data, so we can collect sensitive data, and as I mentioned, it is HIPAA compliant and it's suitable for sensitive clinical research and clinical trials. It allows for a lot of collaboration and multi-site use. So a lot of our use cases will be working with multiple institutions. Maybe it's multiple hospitals or multiple universities, and REDCap allows us to do that. And then we have automated workflows, so things like branching logic, automatic notifications, really kind of all of the bells and whistles that REDCap allows. And on the screen, this is just a quick screenshot of what a REDCap form would look like here in the online designer. And then on the left-hand side, we have a lot of sort of links, but this is all the different functionality that it allows. So in terms of methods for data collection in REDCap, we can have surveys. So these are fully customizable and they can be distributed in a variety of ways. And we can have things like some type of conditional logic where, say, our patient from our first survey, if they meet some criteria, then we're able to send out a second survey based on that criteria, which is pretty cool. And then we have our forms. These are going to be for internal use, where our data entry people or our sort of researchers in clinical settings will be entering the data on behalf of our patients. And then we have longitudinal data collection. So if you've heard of multi-arm studies or longitudinal studies, it has a lot of bells and whistles for setting up those types of studies. And then as we get into things like mobile health and offline data collection, REDCap does offer a application that you can add to a mobile device where your patients can enter information, either like on a daily basis or what have you. So all this said is the incorporation and adoption of REDCap into clinical settings, especially university hospitals, allows librarians to really get a foothold in the education for this tool. And it allows us to be sort of at the front end of education for it. So this is a great article written by my predecessor, Kevin Reed, and my colleague, Fred LaPola, about how REDCap really allows us a new hat for librarians. So it puts the library as a key resource for data management. It allows us to provide essential training and consultations on REDCap and promote its adoption in things like research data collection and improving researchers' data management practices. And the initiative, especially at NYU Health Sciences Library, expanded our role, especially in data services, and it allows us to work one-on-one with a lot of different research projects, but then also allows us to have quarterly classes on REDCap classes. But we do have a problem. Our CRDM class, which I started teaching when I came on board, was really being taught as an as-is basis. So a research team would invite us, or there was maybe a summer program where they're like, we really want our our interns or whatever to have some base knowledge in CRDM. And then kind of separately, we had 5 classes on REDCap where we taught an introduction to REDCap, survey design, building forms quickly, longitudinal studies, and then importing and exporting. But the CRDM concepts were tangentially included, things like data validation, ontologies, variable naming, so on and so forth. So the current problem was that CRDM was being built or being taught in isolation of these 5 classes, yet there were so many commonalities and crossovers. And we definitely tried to incorporate CRDM classes or concepts into these classes, but it wasn't as explicit as it could be. So our solution was to extend the REDCap curriculum to include a CRDM class at the beginning. And those principles are then covered throughout the workshop and touched upon throughout the REDCap series. And then this gave us a really good, or sort of the overhaul of the curriculum, gave me and Michelle an opportunity to work together, which was great. And then we were able to update and extend that class. So we extended it with new information, such as the NIH Data Management and Sharing Plan, updated examples and citations, updated roles in clinical data management and roles of data managers, which is really important when we think of the Data Management and Sharing Plan, that element 6, really where who is going to be in charge for things like data quality checking, audits, maybe testing a data pool with your statistician. So really thinking about those roles, and then also data standards. With that said, data standards was a big improvement of the curriculum, and I'm going to go ahead and hand the reins over to Michelle to talk about that.
Thank you. And actually, as a disclaimer, while this next section focuses on data standards, I'd like you all to think of this as an example of how we undertook a similar approach to teach and relate other CRDM concepts like data documentation and study roles to features of this CRDM platform we're using of REDCap. So the audience of these workshops, which wasn't mentioned earlier, we were typically study coordinators and data managers, and we were interested in merging theory and practice, as Genevieve mentioned. This was reflected in these implicit learning objectives for the data standards section of the CRDM and REDCap workshops. Next slide, please. So given the time constraints, the first workshop was an hour. We covered, gosh, I think the whole gamut of CRDM concepts that were outlined in the Venn diagram earlier. So given these time constraints, we focused on laying a foundation. We wanted to ensure that learners would be able to explain the concept. So here, what is a data standard? Provide them with resources to locate appropriate data standards, and finally, examples of how these can be implemented in the REDCap platform. So next slide, these are resources that I provided to our learners regarding data standards. We spent time reviewing the ones that were implemented in REDCap. So that included the REDCap instrument library or the REDCap shared library, which contains a curated listing of instruments which were formatted for the platform. I also spent some time reviewing the NIH Common Data Elements repository and bioportal ontologies. Again, we spent a little more time on this because REDCap makes it easy for users to import these services into their surveys, and it covered potential pitfalls such as coding issues introduced by importing CDEs. Instead of a live demo, the workshop had included static screenshots that highlighted areas of the screen that users should note or would interact with. And these two screenshots, for example, cover the first two steps related to importing CDEs from the NIH CDE repository in REDCap. I think this segues nicely to our next point. Genevieve?
Yes, so I can close this out. So next up, we've been actually working really closely with our clinical education librarians, and they often focus on things like systematic reviews, but we're collaborating with them to create some asynchronous CRDM modules on Focus, which is our learning platform for compliance. So these are going to be bite-sized CRDM concepts. So just kind of very nice videos, maybe 5 to 7 minutes on some of the concepts. And this may be a potential requirement before data collection even happens. All right, with that said, I am happy to go ahead and take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you, Genevieve and Michelle. Do we have any questions? And you can put questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and unmute. We have 5 minutes, so. There's a question. How do you assess your CRDM class?
That is a great question. So we send out a REDCap form, evaluation form to anyone who takes our class. And it's a general form about that we use for every class that we teach. And it just asks about what you expected to learn from the class. Did you get those learning outcomes? And will you incorporate it into your work?
Okay, there's several questions.
Yes, I
The
know.
next one,
Okay.
yeah, if you want to, you could also choose which ones, but just the next one that came in was, do you?
This is a good question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the library manages education for REDCap, but the REDCap instance sits within our IT department. And so if people have questions about integration with Epic and REDCap, we send them to the IT department, but we're actually working really closely with them. We created a series of videos or asynchronous videos for them, and there's some new features in REDCap related to things like randomization that we are working with them to just sort of upskill and know what they want to do with these new features. And this has been really helpful because we are in the future where we may have a more sort of research-centric instance of REDCap, and then more of a sandbox instance, because within REDCap, you can have a project that's in development or in production. If it is in development, you can make changes, but once it's moved to production, it locks the project. And we're finding some research will not move their project over, which we definitely want it to be locked down before people do data collection. So trying to figure out the best way forward in terms of our instances. Okay, there was a question. What was that at the end? Were you making some async modules? Oh yeah, so this is a question that came up is, do we actually want folks to go through our class series before they start any type of project? And this is because we do have a lot of more sort of regulations and requirements through our funders and just at our institution in general. So could this be, I don't want to say a gateway, but something that you do need to go through before you start building a project? And that is not set in stone. It's just something that we're toying with. And there was a question about which unit would do that. It would be based on what REDCap would like to see from their users, but also it could be department specific. So there's a question, any suggestions on how to start the collaborating with whoever does REDCap instruction at your institution? Our REDCap instruction is run through IT. That is a great question. And I think the partnership between the library and the IT, especially around REDCap, has been really instrumental. So I would ping them, see if what you can provide them with, start with, an introductory meeting to see what you can provide and what they need. I think it's a really good opportunity, especially if you do have REDCap at your institution and there's no REDCap education being offered. And I should mention, if you are interested in REDCap, there's a good Coursera course on data management. I think it's clinical data management that was actually written, and the instructor is the developer of REDCap. It's great, absolutely wonderful. I took it right after library school, and it taught me so much. And there's a question, do you work with any faculty or staff from a research office in developing the class? I personally don't, but some of the class material did exist or was developed before I started, so they might have met with some faculty or staff when they were developing those. And Michelle, if you have any input, please feel free to chime in.
It is time for our next short talk. So, but yes, Michelle, Genevieve, thank you. If you want to continue the conversation in the chat, if you have any more to add, any more questions, you can continue in the chat. But our next short talk is, what do researchers think about when they think about research data as sensitivity?
Sorry, everyone, just working on sharing the slides.
Yes, hi. We'll try to have one of us advance the slides, so we'll see how well that works. Thanks, Derek. So my name is Dessi Kirilova, and I work as the Senior Curation Specialist for the Qualitative Data Repository. This is part of a broader research project that Derek and I have been working on, and we'll explain in a second what the broader project's about and what this piece is about, but I'll let him introduce himself quickly as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Derek Robey. I'm trained as a sociologist, and I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. And we also have with us Isaac Slaughter. Oh, sorry, Dessi. Isaac Slaughter, who's a graduate student at the University of Washington.
Who's not here to present, but was also instrumental in the especially analysis part of this work. Okay, can you advance, Derek?
Yep.
Keep going. Yeah, thanks. So just very quickly about how and why we did this empirical project. In a lot of both theoretical and empirical discussions, not least the presentations that came before ours, but a lot of published work as well. When data sharing factors are considered, obviously the data sensitivity factor is a big one. It comes up, researchers talk about it. You know, those of us who study these topics talk about it. In practice, when it comes to how repositories operate, for many repositories, especially those that are self-deposit, researchers, as part of the terms and conditions of use, have to attest that they're not actually submitting sensitive data. And then for other repositories, such as QDR, which is fully curated, but also others following this model, we do assist researchers and facilitate the sharing even of sensitive data, but always with, you know, special kind of finding the optimal special conditions under which this could be done. But all of that's premised on an understanding. I think you can advance, Derek, to the next slide. All of that's premised on an understanding, kind of a shared understanding amongst repositories and researchers of what sensitive means, which in reality is not actually always so clear. And just as a quick example, so for QDR, when we're dealing with sensitive data, we might offer any combination of these techniques, sometimes all of them together, other times, you know, a couple that are most appropriate, but always starting with an explicit informed consent for sharing by the human participants that were involved in the data collection, then some sort of assessment together with the depositor on the level of sensitivity that then determines the specific configuration of, let's call them privacy preserving techniques. So de-identification very typically, which can again vary in its degree, I guess, from starting with just removing direct identifiers, then removing indirect identifiers, and sometimes the third level of kind of removing contextually identifying information, then maybe graduated access controls, and the specific graduation can differ. And then sometimes none of those are sufficient, and just presenting the qualitative or multi-method data in the aggregate only could be the solution. So again, all of that speaks to the need of understanding really what it is that researchers have in their heads when they say that their data is sensitive. So that's the motivation behind this piece of the research. So we did, Derek, next slide, please. We did a survey that had three main components, and I'll quickly describe them, then I'll say kind of when this survey happened and how we collected the results. But there was a small kind of piece that asked people about their professional position, background, you know, year of degree, final degree achieved, that kind of general sense of what type of researchers were answering our questions without asking them otherwise identifying information. What we really wanted to look for is whether there are big differences in understanding of sensitivity, as well as on this other segment of the survey that I'll talk about in a second, across 12 disciplines. And we were very purposeful in both selecting the disciplines, but then also selecting the 2,400 researchers to whom we sent the survey. So it's not a random survey. It was not intended to be, but it was intended to be, to reach a very diverse group in terms of research experience, you know, length of kind of tenure, discipline, obviously, which, as I said, was important to us, types of research methodology, types of populations studied. I'm trying to remember what the other domestic versus international kind of research experience. Those are the types of criteria on which our sample varied. And as I said, 12 disciplines that we primarily serve were of interest to us. We conducted the survey between the 7th and the 31st of December last year. It was fairly extensive. So I started to describe what the survey included. So in addition to the professional description of each respondent, then there was a big section with hypothetical vignettes that describe different research scenarios. And again, those were completely made up by us, but they also varied on these dimensions that I mentioned, so that we could see whether there were any patterns in how people assess the sensitivity of these research scenarios, right, that we presented to them, and whether, again, in these hypothetical cases, whether they thought the data were appropriate for sharing and under what conditions they were appropriate for sharing and with what techniques they might deem them appropriate for sharing. So this is a piece of the data that we haven't fully analyzed yet, so that's not what this presentation is about. What this presentation is about is the third part, where we asked very similar questions, except they were directed in the context of the respondents' own research. So we asked them to kind of briefly describe to us one project that they had kind of top of mind, and then respond to a set of questions about the sensitivity of that project, of the data that came out of it, what they did or didn't do with respect to data sharing. So this is what we're focused on presenting the results of here. Obviously, as with many surveys of this sort, there are limitations. We only achieved about a 10% response rate. That's full people who responded to the full 20 or so minute survey. So we had to discard a number of incomplete responses. What was more unfortunate in our assessment of how this went is that we did not achieve the desired proportional representation across the 12 disciplines. There were certainly some disciplines that were more represented than others, and clearly we had no control over who chose to respond all the way. Respondents also interestingly labeled their fields of study differently from how we had identified them based on their professional websites. We don't think that really changes our interpretations, especially the way we're presenting things here. We group things very broadly into biomedical sciences and social sciences. But it was interesting that, even on that, there is disagreement about what discipline one comes from. And then, of course, as always with surveys, that there is the self-selection and non-response bias. So those are caveats that we are aware of. But aside from that, just quickly to give you a sense, all kinds of methods were represented. So that on that one, we did achieve the variability that we wanted. The red, pinkish salmon portion of the bars is the percentage of people, the number of people in this case who said that they used that technique, that data collection technique in their work. So there's lots of online surveys, but there's also in-person surveys, interviews, focus groups, clinical trials, using personal health records, previously collected archival data, and then obviously others. So we felt good in terms of the representation of different data collection techniques. Similarly, excuse me, the types of populations our respondents said that they involve in their studies, a lot of just general population without any specific categories, but then also children were represented, elderly people, various minorities, people with various medical conditions, and so on. So we, again, felt that we achieved the kind of variability that we were looking for in terms of experiences with different types of research. Now, to our findings regarding the respondents' view on sensitivity, we had one question in particular that was a free text answer. We intentionally did not define sensitivity for people, although we, by that point in the survey, had asked them a number of questions where that term was employed. And so clearly they had some concept of sensitivity in their head, and we were trying to capitalize on that. And so kind of suddenly in the middle of the study, we asked them, okay, now you tell us, what did you have in mind when you said that, your own research or this hypothetical study that we're describing to you involves sensitive data? And so on trying to analyze the free text answers qualitatively, we came up, so these are categories that we then have imposed based on the inductive look at the responses. So some big categories that occur frequently. So some kind of personal health information always raises people's sensitivity, flags, whether there's a legal component, like legally protected health data, or not necessarily, depending on the research context. Then other legally protected information. So things like FERPA and GDPR and some other international privacy laws were mentioned in some of these free text answers. Then more generally, when people gave a general definition of what they meant by data sensitivity, it describe basically revealing something about the participants that the participants might not want known about themselves or might not want broadly known. Then related to sensitivity, but for some people that was kind of the core of their definitions, the potential to cause harm to participants if disclosed, which we treated kind of differently from just being something that the participant might not want known about themselves, a completely kind of separate concern was if that could also bring harm to the participant, or was seen to potentially bring harm. And then there were some very idiosyncratic ones that we don't yet have a good category for. So they were in that residual category, otherwise subjectively defined by our respondents. Next slide, please, Derek. And then from the people who did say that their own research projects involved sensitive data, we looked at, again, how they specifically described what the sensitivity in that context was. And these are some of the results. Now here, this is not based on the previous, like it's different from the previous one in the sense of this is based on pre-coded categories that we gave them and asked them to choose from, whereas the previous ones were just their free text answers, right? So here we have a number of categories that people chose from, including there was also my data are not sensitive in this project that I'm thinking about. So 27 of the respondents listed the data that they were thinking of as not sensitive, which in this case was about 13%, which is, I think, interesting. It's good from our perspective as a repository to know that people do make that distinction, that they don't always assume that just because they're involving human participants in their research, immediately that means the data are always sensitive. That's a message that we, in our education to people, always promote, that you have to kind of actually sit and think about, is this sensitive? And while in most cases the assessment is yes, it's still important to know that there are cases where the researchers, we hope correctly, but that they think that the data may not be sensitive. But from the rest who did say that there were sensitivities with their data, the factors that seem to most matter and kind of almost kind of at the same level matter in determining whether the data was sensitive or not are their specific research topic, the characteristics of the participants, and the potential for identifiability amongst the information that's given by the participants. Then kind of as a second, one second, just back for a second. As a second order of kind of set of factors that might make data more sensitive are contextual elements, again, legal requirements, and the content of the data, meaning what specifically people said or revealed about themselves. Then things like method of data collection and specific form of data collection do not seem to matter in researchers' assessments of the sensitivity of the data. And just as a methodological point, these are not mutually exclusive categories. People were allowed to list several. Okay, go on. Here, going back to our interest in whether these kind of assessments by the researchers of the sensitivity of their data varied depending on what we came to call discipline family, again, when we grouped it back into a broad biomedical category and a broad social science category. The interesting maybe discovery, for us, it was a little counterintuitive. We thought that there would be much more of a distinction, I would say that. But somewhat interestingly to us, the distinction wasn't so great, right? There's some minor differences in assessment, but it's not so great. If anything, we were more intrigued by the fact that the unsure category varied between the two groups, right? As a whole, the unsure category is very small, but the biomedical researchers were much more unsure about how to assess the sensitivity of their data than the social scientists. And again, something that we should further explore probably. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, now it's Derek's turn.
Great. So we were also interested in sort of how data sharing plans sort of manifested across these disciplinary boundaries and whether or not those data sharing plans came to fruition in the actual practices that the researchers reported in terms of whether or not they had shared their data or not. So I'll begin with a bit of a sort of overview broadly on sort of how these two relate. So you can see the data sharing plans along the rows. In the top row, we have they did not plan to share any of the data. The second row is that they plan to share some of the data from the project. And the third row is that they plan to share all of the data from their project. So it's often the case that like whether, for example, if they planned not to share any of the data, most of those folks ended up not sharing any of the data and did not have any plans to do so. And most of the folks who plan to share all of their data either had not shared but will share in the future. That's that 44% figure in the bottom left. or that they had already shared some of the data. And very few said that they had not shared any data and that they do not plan to do so. So for the most part, the plans are coming to fruition in the practices, but we wanted to look into some of the factors that might affect these different plans and whether or not those practices sort of came to fruition. So we started by looking at what we call the discipline families. Again, that's the biomedical versus the social sciences. Here's the table for this figure, but I think it's easier to sort of see the differences or lack of differences, as the case may be, in the bar charts. So here you can see that biomedical and social scientists researchers didn't really have much variation in terms of their plans to share the data. Where we do see some differences in those discipline families is actually in whether or not they had shared some of their data at that time. So interestingly, whether or not they had shared all their data, biomedical and social scientists, roughly, in the high, slightly below 40% of each in each discipline, indicated that they had shared all the data from the project that they were talking about. Where we see some differences are in the some and none categories. So among the folks who said that they had not shared any of the data, or among biomedical scientists rather, a greater proportion of them had said that they had not shared any of the data from their project as compared to the social scientists, which is something that we found slightly surprising. We also looked into whether or not an external party had requested that they shared their data, and these external parties tended to be funders like NSF, NIH, or the like, or journals who had required that if you're going to publish here, you need to share your data. Both of these are sort of increasingly common. And here we see that biomedical researchers were slightly more likely to have the experience of an external party requesting that they share the data, which makes it somewhat surprising that fewer had shared their data. Especially given what we can see here, which is that external requests to share the data are more do increase the likelihood that someone has actually shared the data. So if you look at these orange bars, for example, researchers who had experienced an external party calling for their data to be shared were much more likely to have shared the data than those who had not experienced that. And furthermore, they were more likely or less likely to have not shared the data at all. And then this is about data sensitivity. So that was kind of one of the interesting things that one of the things that we were interested in as well, is whether or not the sensitivity of data affected the actual data sharing practices. So this cluster on the left is the folks who said that their data were not sensitive, and the cluster on the right was the folks who said that their data were sensitive. And one of the big findings is that, sensitive data, folks who said that their data were sensitive were more likely to say that they have not shared their data and they do not plan to. And folks, in the other existing corollaries. I see that our time is up, so I do want to move on to the last portion and turn it back to Dessi.
Well, just very quickly that, in one basic sense, we are reassured. We thought that the fact that people appropriately understand the different factors taken together might affect the sensitivity. That was good. The fact that a significant portion, small but still significant, did not assess data from a specific project to be sensitive was, in our assessment, kind of a good sign that people can make distinctions, that it's not this kind of complete sometimes misapprehension that anything that involves human participants immediately is sensitive. Now, we were surprised, as Derek highlighted, by the lack of some of the distinctions that we expected to be there. But overall, maybe it's not surprising that slightly more biomedical researchers than social scientists perceive their data to be sensitive. And then as a result, probably the slightly higher proportion that we found amongst our respondents anyway, of biomedical researchers who had not yet shared any data. And then in terms of what data librarians, such as most of the audience probably can take away to their work, is that making sort of an informal risk assessment or sensitivity assessment of the planned data project should be a component of the initial data management and sharing planning that you all probably assist many researchers with. That just even asking people to pause at that early moment and decide, okay, do we think that the data that are going to be collected in this form are sensitive, to what degree are they sensitive, and in what form then can they be shared as a result, with what potential privacy preserving techniques, could probably lead a long way to having more people share some of their data appropriately, even if they're sensitive. So we'll stop here so that we can move with the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Derek and Dessi. We are out of time for a Q&A, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and maybe Derek, Dessi, you can take a look at answer some questions in the chat. But it's time for our first break. We have 15 minutes. So, well, now it's 13 minutes, but we'll pick back up at 11:15 with our second set of short talks. But please take a moment, stretch break, bio break, food break. We will have a very short break between our next short talk block and our keynote. So I'm going to stop talking.
Okay.
Great. Welcome back for our second set of short talks for today. Our first up, we have introducing a new library carpentry course for data management planning, and I'll let speakers introduce themselves.
Everyone, hey, our presentation is going to introduce this new Carpentry's course for librarians on providing data management plan review services to researchers. Development of this course was sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences via a grant through UCLA as part of a new Carpentry series called Lessons for Librarians in Open Science Principles and Methods. And we'll introduce ourselves on the next slide. First off, I'm Marla Hertz. I'm the Associate Professor and Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And Daria Orlowska is another member of this group. She's a data librarian and associate professor at Western Michigan University. I don't know if she's here right now, but I'll just call her out. She may be in the meeting. And Lena, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Lena Bohman. I'm the Senior Data Management and Research Impact Librarian at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra and Northwell. And Northwell is a large hospital system in the New York City area.
The three of us really worked equal parts collaboratively to build this DMP 101 course. But let's first talk about why we proposed to do this course in the first place for library carpentry. So this was foremost in response to the 2023 update to the NIH data management and sharing policy. As this group is well aware, that was a major policy update and a big step towards open science. And it left room for librarians to help do the work of educating researchers and reviewing plans. A lot of that times that falls on librarians. And so Lena, Daria, and I, we actually met while working together on a cross-institutional project that created resources for both researchers and librarians who are working on implementing the policy at their institution. And as part of that work, we noticed an uptick in the number of data management librarians positions out there and an influx of new librarians librarians new to data librarianship, which were tasked with these support roles for data management and for data management plan review specifically. And so you've probably noticed similar trends. And it became clear to us that there was a gap in practical training in providing data management plan review services. And so we wanted to offer that to librarians. And so that's how this course came about. We envisioned it would be useful to anyone new to data management planning, but also especially useful to those from small or under-resourced institutions. And the goal of the course is by the end of it, it's about 90 minutes long, librarians should be able to offer basic data management plan review services to their researchers. Next slide, please. Okay. Actually, and I'm going to pop a link in the chat to the course itself, and Lena is going to give a demo in just a moment. But for the course itself, so the goal was, again, to help someone who's currently a librarian learn more about doing data management plan review services. And to achieve this goal, we created a 5-part course, and that's outlined here on this slide. So in carpentry speak, each section is called an episode. So our 5 episodes are written there in the ovals. And underneath each of those, we put a brief description of the learning objective for that section. So the first episode is a brief overview of data management plans. We lay out the components of an ideal data management plan, and we cover some important background information. The second section is a way to find useful resources for librarians to use when providing guidance on DMPs, such as how to find funder requirements, how to find fair repositories, good data standards, and example plan. And I should say that even though this project came about because we were thinking about the NIH policy, the course itself is meant to be more policy agnostic. It can work for any types of funders. The third episode is on how to support researchers, and it talks about doing data interviews, how to conduct one properly, and it scaffolds off of what many would already be familiar with, especially if they're reference librarians, doing a reference interview. The fourth section, we do some video demos of DMP tool and talk about some common data management plan issues. So what kind of things, when you're doing a review of a data management plan, what kind of things you might find and how to talk to a researcher to help correct those issues. And then the last section, we talk about strategies for starting data management plan services in the library. Who do you need to talk to on campus? And what challenges may come up when you're trying to start these types of services. And the course, like I said, it's about 90 minutes long. It can either be self-taught or anyone can teach it through the library carpentries. Next slide, please. I especially wanted to share with this group a little bit of the behind the scenes and talk about the timeline in case anyone's interested in putting together a similar course, thinking about, what it takes. And so we were the first cohort of this open science series by Carpentries. And so we submitted our proposal in January 2023 and heard back that it was accepted in June of that year. And then the UCLA coordinators, they facilitated this 10-week long project or seminar series from July to October. And so that was the real, when we were really heavily working on the project. We met 2 hours a week for the course itself. And the instructors guided us through the Carpentry's design process, which is like a backwards instruction process. And so then they also taught us about the tools. So like how to use GitHub and RStudio to create the lessons. And what our group did is we created our lessons collaboratively using a Google Docs. And once we had a good working draft of that, we got assistance from the lesson developers at UCLA to help us put it into GitHub. And then we spent a couple of months making edits to the lesson, revising it. We taught it to one another to get timing down, things like that. Then in March of 2024, we submitted it to Library Carpentries. Their curriculum committee reviewed the whole lesson and they met with us. And at that point, they advanced the project to the alpha stage. Before that, it had been in pre-alpha. And basically just what that means is that it's now available for others to teach it. So yeah, it's out there and I put the link in the chat. I think one of the nice things about the Library Carpentries platform is that it's a well-known international organization. And so that kind of helped us get some attention, specifically of 2 other data management planning international groups. So we actually were invited to present on this lesson to the Australian Research Data Commons Data Management Planning Interest Group, the MPIG, in March. And then in July, we spoke with the Canadian DMP expert group. And both of these groups are interested in adapting the course to fit their own federal data management policies. And so we're really looking forward to how this lesson is going to both be teaching new data librarians here in the US, but also abroad as well. And I'll turn it over to Lena.
Okay, so as Marla said, I'm going to do a bit of a demo. And sorry, I was not feeling good this morning, so I decided to work from home, and my dog has decided that he needs to help me present as well. Okay, so if you want to follow along, here's the link, and Marla also put it in the chat. So this is the home page of the course. So you see we have the summary, the overall learning objectives here, and the episodes that Marla went over down the side. So I'm just going to go to episode 4 for demonstration purposes. And at the top, we have the overview. So we have the learning questions and the objectives. These are required by the Carpentry's format. And if you've ever used or seen a Carpentry's course, this will probably look pretty familiar to you. So if you scroll down, you can see these video tutorials for DMP tool that Marla made that we embedded. And these call outs, some of them are activities that we created as part of the course. And then there are also just regular call outs, things to pay attention to, and knowledge checks, some more like multiple choice questions, and anything that has like a specific answer. There are solutions. You can click to see the solution. So if you're doing this on your own, it can be sort of like a self-knowledge check. And down here, we have this section on common DMP issues that Daria wrote. And yeah, Daria did some really nice work here on this section. And even for those of us who are, seasoned librarians, I thought Marla and Daria did a great job with the content of this section, and I encourage you to take a look. Okay, so scrolling down to the bottom, we see the key points, which are just sort of like recaps of the objectives at the bottom. Like if the objectives are what you're going to learn, the key points are what you did learn. So if you go back up to the top, you can switch from the learner view to the instructor view in the Carpentry's instruction. And in the instructor view, you can see these instructor notes, which give you tips about how to teach the course. So here we suggest that instead of viewing the videos in your class, you might want to do these demos live, but you'd watch Marla doing the demos to get an idea of how to do them. So I'm going to switch back to the learner view. We also have a page up here with just the key points. So if you just want to see what's taught in each lesson, you can go to this page and just get a quick overview, and then you can click to go into each episode. And then if you click on more, there's a reference page. So we have overall references, which are just a literature review with articles about data management plans and data management services in libraries. And then further down, we have further reading and resources, which are links that are relevant to each episode that we thought might be of interest, for further reading or further resources. Like in episode 1, we talk about de-identification, so we have some more information about de-identification tools here. Okay. So going back to the presentation, let me pull up my notes. So now that we've got this lesson, we're all serving as maintainers for the Carpentries. So we're in charge of keeping the lesson up to date and fixing any issues. Some of the feedback we've gotten so far is that we should make the course more international. Right now, the course includes a lot of discussion around US-centric policies, so things like the Nelson Memo. And we would like to include DMP frameworks that would make it more widely applicable to other countries. And we've discussed a few possible different ways to do this. For example, creating extra country-specific optional episodes or creating new versions of the course that could be used in other countries. Another idea we have tossed around is to bundle the course together with other open science focused carpentries courses to create like a ready to go carpentries workshop curriculum for open science. So what could you do to help? We hope someone will do some run-throughs of the lesson by yourself or as part of a workshop or a course and provide us with feedback. In order for the course to progress to the next stage of the carpentry's development, we need someone outside of our development group to teach it. And we really hope to see that happen so that the course can continue to progress. If you want to do more than just looking at the lesson, if you have suggestions, a great way to make the suggestions is to use the GitHub pull request so that we can begin incorporating the changes. And finally, feel free to reuse, remix, and share the lesson with others. We think that this is a good resource, but we really want to engage the community and get feedback from others. For those who are data librarians, we hope that the course will be a resource for training new hires or graduate assistants, or for teaching library school classes. So thanks for listening to our presentation, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Lena. Marla? Yeah, there's one question in the chat so far. Was the website created using R?
It was using RStudio and GitHub. We really kind of passed that process off to the developers at UCLA. They were more than happy to help us put it on there. And so I don't have that much personal experience with actually getting it done. Lena, you may have more to add to that.
Yeah, the Carpentries has like a process for creating these sites that like they have like a custom toolkit that runs in R called the Carpentries Workbench. And yeah, if you are curious, you can download it and mess around with it. But for us, it was just easier to just try to work on writing the lesson rather than worrying about we're doing that and R. What's the puppy's name? Oh, his name's Georgie. Yeah, say hi, Georgie. Yeah, he is a terrier mix.
There's another question. Oh, Marla, you want to go?
I'll read it out. If someone were to use your lesson to teach, how would they report back to you or to the Carpentries? I'm not sure if there's a formal reporting mechanism other than doing like those pull requests that Lena talked about. But you're welcome to email us and let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I think just letting us know would be enough, and then we could let the library Carpentries people know that they could, move it forward.
I'll give you back 2 minutes.
Yeah, if there's no more questions, and continue to put questions in the chat if you think of them later. But yeah, we can move to our next short talk. The last one for this section is sentiment analysis on virtual reference transcripts. And Kristin?
Taking a second to try to get my sharing set up properly. All right. Everything look good?
Yep.
So thank you, everyone. I'm Kristin Calvert. I am the Director of Assessment Reporting and Strategic Initiatives at the library at Western Carolina University. Western Carolina University is in Cullowhee, North Carolina, which is on lands from which the Cherokee Indian were displaced. We are also in Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia, and our region was just hit and devastated by Hurricane Helene. So we are in recovery mode. So this presentation is focusing on an introduction to sentiment analysis, specifically assuming that not everyone here is familiar with it and the concepts, to help kind of explore some of the common lexicons used for this activity so that you can be critical in your choice of which tool to use for your own projects or for advising people who may come to you wanting to do their so what is sentiment analysis? It's a natural language process procedure to discern opinion, sentiment, and emotion from texts. At a basic level, a researcher may want to automate a process to decide if your set of text is positive or negative. So are reviews of the latest Alien movie positive or negative? Are the tweets about a candidate's performance from a debate good or not? You know, if you're for us, we were looking at chat interactions between patrons and reference librarians through our virtual reference work. And we wanted to know if they were satisfied or not. The process requires an analysis and classification of text, which is complicated because language is very interpretive. Sarcasm, irony, cultural differences, and context require a very nuanced approach to the analysis. So there are many approaches to sentiment analysis. They largely break down into two broad categories. You have machine learning approaches, which may be supervised or unsupervised. Supervised, for those who don't know, are ones when the text sets have already been labeled as positive or negative, and then you build your algorithm around that to predict against future texts that they have not seen before. And in unsupervised, they do not have that labels. You can have some that are semi-supervised as well, where only a portion of the documents are labeled. You might also see decision trees, support vector machines, and deep learning. These are not going to be covered in my talk today. I'm focused on these lexicon-based approaches. So these rely on sets of words or phrase terms that have been reassigned with a sentiment. So the words are labeled either positive or negative. They may be given a score like a +1 or a -1 or a 0. And some lexicons even assign a larger score to indicate the intensity of the sentiment. And some lexicons apply an emotional label like fear, anger, and disgust. They generally aggregate measures for a document based on a sum or an average with some adjustment thereof. They can be very disciplined and culturally specific. So in some settings, a word may have very negative connotations, where in others it may have positive or it may have neutral connotations. And so you need to be selective about which one you're using for your purposes. And some of these lexicons have additional rules that will adjust scores up or down based on intensity indicators or other contextual adjustments. And so the origin of this work came from a project that my colleague and I are doing on our reference transcripts, where we wanted to do topic modeling and sentiment analysis together, where we pulled apart and identified what sort of chats we had, reference interactions, breaking down into different categories, and then trying to see if patrons had higher or lower satisfaction labels depending on what kind of chat it was. And so at first I did a very straightforward sentiment analysis to look at, and then I plan to do a statistical analysis whether, you know, satisfaction was significantly different between topics. And then it was all going very well until I decided to look at the chat with the most negative score. And it was not a negative interaction at all. It just was about a topic that had certain terms that might be flagged as negative just because of the topic in different context. So here I'm going to do a comparison of several sentiment analysis lexicons. So to help us all make an informed choice, because there's more than the 4 that I'll present today. And so I think in doing this project, I have learned how critical it is to really dig into the documentation and analyze how the lexicon was developed, where the words are coming from, and what sort of scoring it uses to be able to make a good choice about which to use. So I'm going to describe each one, how it was developed, the text it was developed for, and what sort of results it will give you. And then we're going to look at how they all work on the set of chat transcripts that I have been working on, and then do a deep dive into a couple hand-picked ones to see how it performs. So the first one is Vader, which is one that's built into the National Language Toolkit. It's very easy to run in Python. It was the first one I tried. It has both lexicon word assignments and rules. And it was specifically designed to work with Twitter and other social media. So when you're using Vader, it will provide for your chat 4 different scores, a positive, negative, and neutral, which are kind of straightforward ratios for how many, for the proportion of words in the text that fall within those categories. And then it provides kind of an aggregated compound score, which takes all of those individual ratios and then applies some other rules to them and then normalizes the score between -1 and +1. And so it's a very large lexicon. It has over 7,000 words, including slang words, and over 3,000 emojis and emoticons that were hand labeled using Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a platform Amazon provides if you want to outsource this sort of laborious labor to people doing, who are willing to do this much work. And so I pulled a couple of the words just to give you a sense of how it works. So excellent, it's a very positive score of 2.7, and awful gets a -2.0. But there are a great number of words in there that don't have a score, like oppression is not there, so it essentially gets a 0. But oppressed is, and it has a -2.1. And so the takeaway for that is this will be one that you don't want to do a lot of pre-processing on your text, because it will differentiate between words with a similar stem, but different endings. So you want to kind of leave everything as is with emojis and punctuation and everything. AFIN is another one that I commonly see used. It has a much smaller set of words, only a little over 3,000, derived originally for Twitter and then expanded slightly. And these were labeled by the author with a score between -5 and 5. There's not a lot of adjustment when you finish analyzing the text. It just sort of adds up the scores for all the words and presents it as is. Another one I used is this NRC Word Sentiment Association lexicon, which is built on a more general list of words and thesauri that you might see in a lot of different natural language processing. It's also available in multiple languages, not just English. You can also run it in Python 3 fairly easily. And then it will give you outputs, a whole lot of different outputs. So this one not only will do negative and positive sentiment of the text, it will also give you emotional scores, which I was interested in particular for chat transcripts, thinking I might be able to see among patron responses more anxiety or fear about interacting with librarians. And then they give you kind of an association. So you can either have a strong or a negative or neutral association from 0 to 1. And likewise, this one was also done labeled with Amazon Botanical Turk. And the last one is not one that I see used a lot, but it was one that I selected because I thought going at it from a emotional analysis of the chat transcripts would be a better choice. So this linguistic inquiry and word count is a more robust tool than the others I've talked about so far. It's a license that you will need to purchase, and it comes with an app so that you don't have to write your own code to run it. You can load your files and it will do a lot of different natural language processing for you. And it has a very robust output of summary measures, emotions, and various properties. And this was put together by psychologists and backed by a lot of empirical research. So if you go to the website there, they have a lot of supporting documentation that will really help you. And that's one thing that I have found doing this is that the amount of documentation the creators provide varies widely. And so some gives you a lot of information on how to run the code, how to interpret the results, and some are very minimalist. And so you'll need to read research articles published by other authors who have used these tools sometimes to be able to get a more robust understanding of what they are. So the couple things that I was interested in with this is that they give an overall sense of tone, which is both positive and negative, which they break down into percentile. And then they also have emotions, specifically named emotions, but then generally ones that they've grouped into positive and negative. And on their website, they provide norming for you. So if you need to know as a reference what the general positive score for different types of text are, they have maybe 6 to 8 different types of text that you can use scores for. So I looked at their set for blogs and conversations to see where normal scores fell for the positive and negative emotions, which are there. So it's very robust, and you have a lot more options with how to use it. So I put together this little summary chart to help you compare all of them and what sort of comparisons you might do if you're considering a different word source, particularly where they're from, whether they're specifically trained on user reviews or Twitter feeds or from other sources, can depend on how they are going to choose to assign sentiment to the words. I also include some runtime information about the ones that I did when I ran my analysis. I'm a fan of NRC, but the one library I'm using, it's very slow, and so it takes several hours to run against my data set, whereas the other ones are very quick. And then it's good to look at the licensing. Most of them are free for educational research or use common open source licensing, but this one, there was a charge to use. So that's all great, Kristin, but how do I choose? So things to ask yourself. Wow, so fast. Then things to ask yourself, what you want to get from the score, has it been validated? I would suggest that since it's so field dependent that you will want to see if there's something that's already working in your area. How do you want to use the score? Is it important to have tone or emotions? And what's your current skill level? Do you have labels? So to quickly say, we have about 10,000 chats from our library help services. I did very minimal cleaning to remove PII and some other formatting issues. And then I wanted to do a breakdown of how many chats, each of these things classified as positive, negative, or neutral, and then look at kind of a combined score and look at some specific ones to see how it did. So I had to kind of make an arbitrary decision of what neutral meant because all of these were very different scores. So I generally did a neutral as being around the 0 point with a little bit of buffering, using basically what the overall set was to come up with a single term for what it is. So if you look across, All of these for my chats are strongly, strongly positive, which makes a lot of sense. Makes some sense. We didn't see a lot of negative, angry patrons. I find they're mostly neutral, and these, all of the dictionaries tend to over skew positive. So Vader, which is the common one, out of the possible from -1 to 1, it's skewing pretty high, where most things are 0.99. And that's pretty much the same across the board. The majority are reading as positive. Some NRC reads more neutral overall. And there's very low detection of negative chats. So here's one where I was looking at where someone is looking for social work. And I picked that to see because it had some text like child soldiers that I thought might be skewing negative. And so it comes across for a pretty neutral interaction, very strongly positive with Vader, positive across the board. The second one I chose was about colonization and enslaved people. So I thought this could also flag a little negative. Again, most of these are pretty typical reference interactions where the librarians dominate the conversation. And again, Vader, very strongly positive. In this case, the other ones came across as more neutral. A third one was another discussion of looking for a specific article and how to look that up on our homepage, dominated by the Librarian. And this one, for some reason, very weakly neutral in Vader, otherwise very neutral across the board, without my interpretation of that being very different overall. And then the last one I did was another reference interaction about obesity and health indicators. Again, the only difference here is that it has a lot more exclamation points and some emojis, and it came back strongly positive again, and positive overall. So here is the most negative one that started me on this whole process, was with both Aphid and Vader. This one came across as very negative, where it was basically a patron giving a list of 12 different articles that all had some kind of a health concern that they were researching, that the librarian then found and then made the links back. And these were almost like the most negative scores that you could possibly get when there was no indication that it's a bad interaction. And likewise, the other ones were not great at detecting like bad. Small text sizes were a problem for some things, where it skews too negative if there's not enough words to compare it to. And so my quick recommendations are that none of these are particularly helpful for identifying patron dissatisfaction. Vader and Aphid in particular skew way too positive or way too negative for seemingly arbitrary topical reasons. NRC and linguistic inquiry provide interesting possibilities for emotional responses, but again, they're not great at identifying whether a chat went poorly. So our chat corpus was not super big. A larger number of chats might yield different results. If we limited to just reference interactions and not these kind of dangling chats that end up, or directional or building questions, you might see different results from the results. I would also go forward and say that we should exclude very short chats because they skew the results and aren't very helpful. Another thing we might be able to do is exclude librarian responses because they tend to dominate and have a lot of library-specific information. But nonetheless, none of this seemed to be a replacement for human review. And what I was able to take away from my human review was far and above more useful than anything that the sentiment analysis provided. So thank you. My GitHub here has the Jupyter notebooks with the code if you want to use it, along with some Zucker references with some general information about sentiment analysis that I found really useful. So.
All right, thank you, Kristin. And we have just about maybe a minute or two for questions. Oh, question just came in. Kristin, what would you recommend for sentiment analysis on a list of subject headings?
I don't think I would use it. For a sentiment analysis, I think where we might see problems with subject headings aren't going to get flagged by some of these common dictionaries. And you'll probably see the same sort of issues where topics are flagged as negative because in other contexts, talking about them on Twitter would feel like a negative conversation. So actually, we can definitely talk about that later to see what you want to get from a sentiment analysis of subject headings.
There's also a question, do you have any advice for data librarians working with patrons who want to learn more about sentiment analysis?
I would say there's definitely some resources in the Zotero thing. If we can I'll get the link sent to everybody so that it's working, that are very accessible to read. Some of the articles you'll find are really, really detailed, too technical for, I think, most people coming in to get started. And then otherwise, I would say to give them there's plenty of like general introductory stuff, I think, on NLTK about the topic in general, but there's definitely some articles that were easy to read.
All right, great. So I think we'll stop here to take another short little break before our keynote. Thank you again to all of our presenters of the short